Hi, I'm Batsa and I've been playing a lot of Pax Dei since it came out in early access. Today I'm going to share everything I know about dungeons. Let's try to make a quick summary of them before delving deeper into the subject. Dungeons are marked on the map with this icon of the Imperium Ruins, the one with the V or 5 at the bottom of it. There are 16 dungeons in total in the game currently, 4 in each province, and they contain named NPCs which drop the sigils that can make the highest ranks of the currently available spells. They also have regular non-name NPCs which drop the relics needed to make those magic armor pieces or weapons. The best two of them, tattered sigils and crimson runic leashes, are the most sought after items in the game currently, as they are the limiting factor in acquiring the magic gear, not the spells we get from the named NPCs. You need 20 or 25 of these per each magic item craft, and you need to spend a lot of time in dungeons to farm enough of them to make all the magical gear you want. And not all crafts are guaranteed ones. Some of them require really high level in a profession to make, up to level 47. I failed my craft for the Fireball 3 bracers and lost 22 out of the 25 Crimson Runic Leashes, as well as the spell itself. It was very painful. As you may expect, you can't solo the dungeons, at least not since the Fire Dot started breaking the Mesmerize. I'd say that the minimum number of people needed to run a dungeon is 4, though it's possible to do it with 3 if you come prepared. 6 people is the sweet spot in my opinion, and it is also the maximum number of people that you can fit in a group. Bringing more than 6 can make the dungeon go a bit faster, but you'll probably receive less tattered sigils and less relics from named NPCs per person if you go in a large group. There's also the issue with the loot. The rules for loot have changed in the Proving Grounds update. The person or party who did the most damage to a target will have looting rights, and it will only become free for all loot if it hasn't been looted for 5 minutes. So when there are more than 6 people in a dungeon in 2 groups, you'd have people who wouldn't be able to loot some of the enemies. It can cause some minor issues. Let's discuss each aspect of the dungeons in more detail. As I said, there are 16 dungeons in the game, and it is possible to see the list of them on the Pax Dei database website. All of these dungeons are Zebian ones, so all humanoid NPCs in them are from the Zebian faction, and they also contain demons, imps and hellions, and corrupted animals. The dungeons come in 2 tiers. Each zone has 3 lower tier dungeons, which are smaller in size and contain lower level enemies, and 1 dungeon of a higher tier, a temple dungeon, which is bigger, has higher level enemies, and those are much more lucrative to run compared to the lower tier ones. The higher tier dungeons are the last 4 in the list, those which start with the name Zebium: Ambolon, Diralisen, Pelipis, and Plizon. Or Plizon, I'm not sure how to pronounce this word. The lower tier dungeons have a secret entrance that can be located very far from the main entrance on the map. The advantage of those is that all of them are located in caves which have no enemies and you can safely enter the dungeons, unlike the main entrances, where you'd have to fight enemies to get in, like you can see in this footage. The database website and the interactive map currently don't display the names of the dungeons on the map, or the secret entrances, so I'm showing now the maps from a website that was made by someone called Potato Jam. I don't know who that is, but these are very helpful. The Zebium Diralisen and the Rivulet switch locations in the new patch, but all other locations should be accurate. Link to the website is in the description. In here, you'll also be able to find layout maps of the dungeons themselves. The game doesn't have a map when you open it inside the dungeons, you just see a black screen with the dungeon name and the players near you. So these are very useful and I appreciate the effort of making them. In order to decide which dungeon you want to go to, you can check the database website. You can go to spells and look for one that appeals to you. Lois Blessings 3, for example, is a very good one as it gives 60 HP buff for 1 hour. And unlike Lois Favor, it's an AoE spell, it affects all players in range and not just yourself and one other player. So when I click on it, I see that there's only 1 relic and 1 armor piece that have this spell. When I click on the relic, I see that it drops from the Wicked Liturgist. And when I click on him, I see that he's located in the Zebium Ambolon in Keris, so I need to go there to try to get this relic. Another option is to do it the other way around. Go to dungeons on the website and check the named creatures in the list to see what they drop. I'm already at the Zebium Ambolon page, so I can check what sigils the named NPCs drop and which spells they are used for. Some of them don't drop any sigils, but others do. As you already know, or probably can tell from the maps, it can take a long time to get to a dungeon, up to 1 hour, even when using the unstuck option to help you save some running time. This can be a big problem if you hate running to a dungeon each time you want to do them. This can be partially mitigated if you have outs that you can place in the valley close to the 4 big dungeon entrances, since they are a lot more rewarding than the other ones, and you or someone else in your clan can place a plot in that area, where you will be able to repair your items and restock your food and potions for the dungeons. I have an out and a plot close to the Pleasant dungeon in Marie, so I can get there fast instead of running from my base in Ancien. You can see my plot on the map, and there's a short run from it to the dungeon. Currently my out is located near the dungeon entrance. You can also park your character at the dungeon entrance if you don't need it anywhere else until the next run in that dungeon. But then you need to bring more weapons, food and potions, and you have less room in your inventory for the loot from the dungeon. What do you need to bring for the dungeon run? Come in full armor, obviously. The Jack of Plate should be enough for most people. Bring the highest level weapons you can get, one for each hour that you will be spending time in the dungeon. They break down pretty fast. Two-handed maces are very good now, they have large AoE and they stun the enemies for 2 seconds with a special attack. Bring a stack of 3 food buffs. It's good to have health, poison and fire resistance and stamina as your foods. I personally use the elderberry syrup, heavy wheat bread and bold winter stout. But you can get away with lower level foods. It is possible to take 0 damage in dungeons for all but one person if done in a particular way. I'll expand on this in a bit. You should bring a stack or 2 of health potions. I do believe that they are much better than any other potions, including the new ones to use in dungeons. I bring the highest level ones that gives me 120 HP over 1 second. Other than that, keep everything else at your base. You should have as many free slots as possible for the dungeon loot. Oh, maybe bring a torch or a lantern. It can get pretty dark in some areas of the dungeons. But the scenery there is very nice. I like it a lot. I'm located just inside the dungeon for the background footage for this video. Which spells are good to bring to the dungeons? Healing spells are good to bring, especially Radiant Mend, which is an AoE heal. One person should bring the highest level HP buff to your group, ideally Lowest Blessing 3. Mesmerize is essential in dungeons, even rank 1 of it is very powerful, it stuns the enemy for 21 seconds. Pacify is an important spell to bring as well, ideally rank 2 or 3, as rank 1 has lower range and a weaker effect. Fireball is nice to have, but not mandatory as it was in the previous patch. And Consecrated Ground is a must if you plan to pull enemies using this spell. The one who'd be using this should bring a bow with a lot of arrows to the dungeon, doesn't matter which kind, wooden arrows will do just fine. He also should bring the strongest shield he has access to, as 100% perfect pulls are pretty hard to do in a long dungeon run, and sometimes he'll receive melee damage. And he needs more healing potions than the rest of the group. Though it's maybe just me being bad in this role, a good player who uses the spell won't receive a lot of damage in dungeons. I haven't been to every dungeon in the game, but the main entrances to the ones I've been to look similar. You have these ruins where you have to fight some mobs to get to the central part. In the central ruin there's a path which leads down into the dungeon entrance. You can fight enemies all the way down to the entrance, but you can take a shortcut. After the stairs you can turn left and left again, jump down into the water and swim through the stairs on the other side. Once you have climbed them, just turn left or right and you're right at the dungeon entrance. There is a loading screen for entering the dungeon, so I guess I can call them instances, but there's only one instance of each dungeon on each server. So everyone who's in a specific dungeon will be placed with everyone else who's in there. This can cause some issues. You can and will run into other groups trying to run the dungeon. This is inconvenient, but except trying to talk to the other group to figure out how you can both do the dungeon at the same time without stepping on each other's toes, there is no other solution for this currently. There are 3 types of enemies in dungeons and the areas surrounding the dungeon entrances. Most of them are melee NPCs, though some of them do have a spell that they use, but they will run to fight in melee after they cast the spell. These include most of the Zebians, the Imps and Hellions, and the corrupted animals. The next type of enemies are the summoners. These will keep summoning imps, the impish interventions, until they are killed. The imps can overwhelm your group, so the summoners are priority targets and should be dealt with before the melee enemies. These include the larval embalmers and the morbus cultivators. The last type of enemies, which is also the deadliest one, is the casters. The Zebian tricksters, deceivers, acolytes, skin dancers, and the ravenous hierophants. These enemies cast a spell targeted at the person who has the aggro, which does poison damage, and it can apply poison damage over time effect to all players in the area, and it also can stack. The poison damage isn't as deadly as it was in the start of early access, and is almost a non-issue when the dungeon group has access to healing spells and potions. But the spell doesn't just poison you. If the spell hits a player, the caster and all other enemies in large radius will heal to full health on impact. So you can see how this can cause a quick wipe of your group. To deal with this, the aggro target should be in melee range of the caster. In that case, the enemy won't cast the spell. The best way to deal with the casters is to pacify or mesmerize them, kill the melee enemies in the area first, and then everyone should get in melee range of the caster and kill him. If a cast was made, it is possible to use line of sight to make the spell hit a wall and not affect players or enemies in range. What about the named enemies? Like their counterparts in the open world, they are just NPCs that have a bit more health and deal a bit more damage than regular NPCs. If you expect lengthy boss fights with different phases, tactics, etc., this is not how it works. It's not World of Warcraft. I mentioned in a previous video how to distinguish between normal and named NPCs. The named ones don't have A or N in front of their name, and it starts with a capital letter. If I go back to the maps website, there's a map of each dungeon in the game. Let's open up the Duralisten one. You can see the dungeon layout and the locations of each named NPC within the dungeon. The named NPCs don't always spawn. There are an 18% chance for one to spawn, but sometimes two of them can spawn together, though it might be a bug. You need to kill the placeholder NPC that spawned instead of the named one, wait 18 minutes for a respawn, and hopefully you'll get the named one next time. For example, we can see that we have these two Hierophants on the left. One of them is a placeholder for a named enemy. And on the next lap we did, the named mob spawned. Ambolon's right hand, who drops the Earth-like Spirit Leash needed to make the Fireball 3 bracers. Staying on the maps website, you can also see the locations of loot piles in the dungeons, which come in different qualities. These can contain random resources, and lately faction relics were added to the possible loot from these, including tattered sigils and crimson runic leashes, so don't forget to loot them when doing a dungeon. The respawn time for the loot in these piles is higher than the enemies. I think it's double, 36 minutes. If you try to loot them before they reset, it will say that they are already looted. And if you have a poison dot on you, you need to wait for it to run out. You won't be able to loot with the debuff on. So what are the best tactics for fighting enemies in the dungeons? You can go with minimal tactics, pacify or mesmerize the casters, prioritize killing the summoners, and then take care of melee enemies, before dealing with the casters in close range. You could use the one-handed and two-handed maces to stun the enemies so you won't take constant damage. And use healing spells and potions to heal up. This tactic will work mostly fine, especially in the lower tier dungeons, and when you're engaged in a fight with only one or two enemies. But there's a better tactic to do the pulls. It involves the Consecrated Ground spell, which, as you can see from its description, draws a ton of aggro and makes the enemies be glued to the person who put the spell on the ground. It works like this. The puller puts the spell on the ground, and the other people make a line stretching from a wall or a pillar, so the enemies won't be able to pass it. The Consecrated Ground person pulls enemies with arrows, or just by body pulling, and runs behind the wall. The enemies try to reach the one with the Consecrated Ground, as it generates a lot of aggro, as I said, but they can't reach him because of the wall, and they can be killed without anyone taking damage. And you can pull a lot of enemies with a single pull with this tactic, like I'm showing now. There are some tips to improve this technique. It is important to keep the wall formation, so the enemies won't get to the Consecrated Ground person. Since attacking moves you forward now, you need to wait until there are enemies in melee range before starting to attack. If an enemy manages to go through or around the wall, it's better to mesmerize it and keep attacking the enemies in front. When all the enemies in the front are dead, the aggro guy can move to the other side of the wall, and the people in it can attack the enemy from the other side while keeping the wall formation. It is possible to bring the summoners to the wall as well, but the Consecrated Ground person needs to run far away in order to bring them into melee range. And it is possible to pull the casters to the wall as well, as long as the puller is out of line of sight for the spell, and then it hits the wall. And in emergencies, when something goes terribly wrong, it's good to have someone, or two people ideally, who have the Haunting Memory spell, which does an AoE stun. During the stun you can resurrect dead people if there are any, heal up, go back to formation and resume the fight. If you have two people with the spell, the enemies could be stunned indefinitely. There are two ways to go about the dungeon. Either do laps, and by the time you've done one lap, or clear the part of the dungeon you wanted to, then you can unstack to be teleported to the dungeon entrance. The enemies will have respawned and you're ready to go again. Or you can target farm specific named NPCs or areas where you get the most tattered sigils or crimson runic leashes. So where do you get the most tattered sigils and crimson runic leashes? Higher level enemies have a higher chance to drop them, so it's better to do the higher level dungeons not only for the better drops from name enemies, but also for tattered and crimsons as well. For example, the Cannibal Champions and the Esoterics of Zed are good enemies to farm them. Some people think that Pleason is the best dungeon for the tattered sigils, but I believe it is the Ralisen. Maybe I shouldn't say it since we run this dungeon a lot and it can already become crowded sometimes, but a lap in the dungeon can yield from 15 to 40 tattered sigils, depending on luck and the percentage of the dungeon you have cleared in that lap. It should take you somewhere between 30 to 60 minutes to do a lap in Duralisen. For the Crimson Runic Leashes, the best place to go, I believe, is Zebium Pelepis, the big dungeon in northeast of Inis Gallia. I haven't been there in a while and don't have footage for it, but there's a large area with imps and hellions in it, you can farm the Crimsons there. Though other dungeons have a decent amount of these creatures as well. What happens if you die or use unstuck in a dungeon? You will be teleported to the dungeon entrance, and possibly to the secret entrance, if it's closer. If your group has wiped, the enemies have respawned, and your corpses are too far away to pull, you have a problem. You'll need a rescue party to retrieve your items, though they do exist for 72 hours before despawning, so you have time to retrieve them. But because of this, you need to be extra careful when pulling the enemies. What about the loot distribution? I believe that the best way to do it is how our clan and several other clans I know are doing it. The tattered sigils are shared equally between all participants, and there is a lottery for the sigils from the named mobs, the Crimson Runic Leashes, and possibly the bloated worms as well. The other relics are less valuable and people can keep the ones they got or discard them unless someone else might need them. It's good to check what other loot people need before running the dungeons, so you won't just drop items that someone else may want. Looted items in dungeons that are useful are, in my opinion, metal ingots, metal sheets, tier 2 leather and hides, all Jew crafting ingredients except topaz and blizzard stone, lowest tier's leaves, and other types of sigils like red runic leashes and cracked lockets. This is it for this video. I have a couple more videos planned for the near future, so stay tuned. You can check the other guides on this channel, like the ones popping on the screen now. Check the description below for some useful Pax Dei links and also links to my Twitch and my second YouTube channels. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.